In the winter of 1846, snow pressed against cabins at Truckee Lake. Trunks lay unopened, journals stopped mid-line. A hymnbook lay frozen beside a fire, its last verse struck through. What else was silenced in snow? A glove stiff with frost, a spoon buried in ash, a diary unfinished. Between 1846 and 1847, 87 entered the pass. Less than half survived. Objects thawed in spring, but many names never returned. When hunger was remembered, what else was left unread? Welcome to history's ledger. This isn't the version they printed in school books, not the one trimmed down to a date and a disaster. This is the version hidden in the folds of a coat that never made it home, in the entries that stopped mid-word, in the frostbitten silence between a hymn's second verse and the third that was never sung. By the spring of 1847, 87 people had entered the Sierra. Fewer than half would come back out. The rest were buried by snow, misjudgment, and a shortcut promised by a man who never walked it himself. This is not the story of hunger. It's the story of what was left untouched. The violin that was never played. The glove too stiff to put on. The coins dropped in snow. The diary that began with hope and ended with nothing at all. Before the names were carved into markers, before the word cannibal was printed in broadsheets, there was just stillness, a cabin beside Truckee Lake, and a snowstorm that didn't stop when the food did. Inside, someone had set down a hymn book, open. It rested near the fire, pages stiff with frost. Only the first two verses were legible. The third was struck through as if the ink had frozen mid-line. No initials, no prayer beneath the song, just absence. The storm that sealed their fate arrived on October 28th, 1846. Weeks too early and days too soon. The Donner and Reed families, along with others who had joined them on the trail, were only 150 miles from safety when the snow began to fall. 3 cabins were built near what's now Donner Lake, rough pine, oxhide doors, canvas roofs. Others dug into the snow or sheltered beneath wagons. A broken axle and an infected hand had left the Donners delayed at Alder Creek. Everyone else watched the snow erase the trail behind them. Inside one cabin, a hymn book lay open near the hearth, its pages curled inward from damp and cold, 2 verses still legible, the third struck through. There was no name written in the margins, no signature, just the end of a song that never finished. They tried to record it all. Patrick Breen's diary began with the weather and ended in prayer. The lines shrank as his ink ran out. Killed my last ox today, gave the yoke to the Fosters. Later, still snowing. Tough times, but not discouraged. Our hopes are in God. Then, silence. Across the snowdrift, the Donners sheltered under low-pitched roofs, sealed with pine and hide. Tamzine Donner, educated and deliberate, reportedly offered rescuers gold to carry her daughters out. They took the children. The coins were later found scattered near the tree line, unburied, unclaimed. A watch was recovered from beneath a wagon. The engraving read, "To G, for the journey." No surname. The hand stopped at 419. Silk gloves, too small for a man's hand, were found folded beside a frozen bedroll. No nearby grave. A violin wrapped in wool surfaced in 1896. Cracked bridge, snapped strings. Inside its case, a note scribbled faintly, "Play when the fire burns low." They brought these things from Missouri: books, Bibles, silver, lace, perfume bottles, polished combs. Luxury not for show, but for continuity, to remain themselves, even at the edge of the unknown. A bottle of medicine was still sealed. A fork, tarnished, bore initials no one matched. A linen bundle contained a scarf and a child's bonnet, dry, untouched. These weren't just things lost. They were things someone thought they'd need again. And still, the hymnbook remained open on the floor. The ink had lifted from the page. No one had closed it. No one finished the line. Whether it was forgotten in haste or left in reverence, it stayed, not as a prayer, but as proof that something had been carried this far and still couldn't survive what came next. They packed more than what survival required. Beneath the flour and salted pork were silk collars, leather-bound books, silver teaspoons, and stitched linen monograms. These weren't the scraps of desperation. They were items chosen carefully by people who expected to arrive somewhere civilized. The Reed, Donner, Breen, and Graves families didn't prepare for disaster. They packed for a future, one with parlors, mirrors, and guests. Some carried violins, others pressed herbs or stationery. A few packed full china sets. One woman brought a collapsible telescope. These weren't luxuries to flaunt. They were memory anchors. When they left Missouri, the Hastings cutoff still sounded promising. The land ahead, unknown. But by the time they reached the salt flats, they had to lighten the load. Wagons stalled, animals collapsed, and one by one, the trunks were left behind, not discarded, but tucked beside trees, under rocks, against logs. Left with intention, left to be reclaimed. They never were. When the salvage teams arrived the next spring, they found some trunks sealed shut by ice. Others split from cold. One opened to reveal 6 books: Shakespeare, a hymnal, and 3 water-stained novels. In another, a child's dress, a folded bonnet, and a pouch of dried lavender. No names inside. George Donner's trunks held more: pistols, jewelry, journals, and a watch that still ticked faintly when found. Tamzine had tried to document everything. Her list was never finished. The velvet she wrapped her writing tools in was torn, stained at the edges. Her handwriting was in the margins of a folded scarf. Some trunks held medicine kits, laudanum, peppermint oil, camphor. A few bottles stayed sealed, others spilled and froze into the cloth that surrounded them. Even the labels wore away. Whatever they were meant to treat, they never got the chance. In a trunk recovered years later, a spoon was wrapped in linen alongside a child's scarf and an unreadable note. The ribbon was faded, the linen had hardened with age, but the items had been arranged, not thrown. They had meaning. One parlor chair was found discarded near a canyon wall, its red damask torn, its wood warped. A journal entry from weeks earlier had mentioned a woman refusing to give it up. She had carried it alone for almost half a mile. The story ended there. Survivors rarely spoke about what was left behind, but decades later, they could describe these things with aching detail. The scent of dried herbs, the sound a comb made in its velvet box, the feel of embroidered initials beneath their fingertips. What makes an object worth carrying through dust, salt, and snow? What makes it worth leaving, even when you never meant to? The answer changed each week, first by weight, then by memory, and finally by what you could no longer afford to lose, even if you knew you might never return for it. Some stories are told through bones, others through entries in a book, but some remain inside trunks that were never opened again. It began with a book. Lansford Hastings had never walked the shortcut he promoted, but in 1845, he published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, where one line promised a new trail, shorter, flatter, better. The phrase Hastings Cutoff sounded efficient, precise, trustworthy. It wasn't. The shortcut was longer than advertised by over 100 miles, dragged them through alkali flats, and cost them nearly a month. But they didn't know that in Missouri. They only had the book and a map drawn from rumor. In early July 1846, at a place called Little Sandy River, the party split. Those who stuck to the established route made it through. Those who followed George Donner and James Reed into the shortcut would be remembered by another name. Some carried their own maps, hand-copied, folded tight, softened at the edges by sweat and dust. One of those maps was found later inside a wrecked trunk, ink smeared across the Great Basin. A name had been written in the corner. It had been scratched out. Not erased, scratched. There's no way to know who held that map last. But whoever it was, they followed it through one of the driest stretches of land in North America. For 5 days, the wagon wheels sank into salt crust that looked firm but turned to mud underneath. One journal called it dragging through syrup made of dust and death. They abandoned 4 wagons there. 36 cattle died. One family walked for hours beside a team of oxen that had given up, the mother carrying a silver tea kettle because it had belonged to her own mother. She dropped it near Pilot Peak. It was found decades later, still dented, still whole. The salt flats were so blinding that by the second day, people began covering their faces with handkerchiefs. Some used lace gloves. Children stumbled with their eyes closed. A young boy in the Graves family walked into a thorn bush he never saw coming. His hands were torn. The gloves he wore were left behind, one soaked in blood, the other clean. Both were recovered in spring. That's how the trail kept its own archive, not with accuracy, but with accident. What the map left out, the land underlined in blood and ash. When they reached the far edge of the salt desert, they stopped to regroup. The animals were spent. Water was nearly gone. That night, someone drew a new map in the dirt, a route from their current position to Sutter's Fort, or so they hoped. They argued over whether to follow it. By morning, wind had erased the drawing. No one had memorized it. They moved forward anyway. Further west, near the Ruby Mountains, they passed through a narrow canyon with walls so close that wagons scraped on both sides. A family tossed out an upholstered chair, red damask, brought from Illinois. They had no idea that the trail they were struggling to stay on had already curved in another direction, and they were now following only its shadow. Years later, that chair was found half buried in pine needles, its wooden leg broken, its upholstery stiff with mildew. No name on the frame, no initials in the fabric. Just a weight someone had once believed was worth carrying. James Reed, exiled after a killing on the trail, later wrote that the worst part wasn't the violence or the snow. It was realizing how many of the maps had lied, that the shortcut wasn't short, that the promises weren't promises, that the trail didn't lead to freedom, it only led forward. One piece of a Hastings map, torn in two, was found stuffed into the spine of a diary in a salvage pile. The top half read, "Easy passage through canyon." The bottom half read nothing. It had been used to plug a gap in the cabin wall. History rarely saves the lies, but sometimes it keeps the paper they were written on, and sometimes it lets the objects contradict the story they were supposed to tell. They gathered brush every morning until their hands cracked. Twigs snapped in the cold, but they were damp beneath the bark. Bark flaked into their sleeves. Sap stuck to their fingers, then froze in place. Starting a fire wasn't a ritual, it was a negotiation with wet wood and hollow breath. In one of the cabins, someone had carved a shallow pit into the center of the floor and ringed it with stones. A kettle balanced on a metal rod between two upright branches. The fire beneath it never caught. Not really. It hissed, smoked, flared for seconds, then died. When rescuers arrived months later, the kettle still sat above the cold ash. Inside, a strip of oxhide, curled at the edge from the last heat it would ever know. Beneath it, bones, charred to splinter, too fragile to identify. The snow came faster than they were told it would. They believed they had 3 more weeks. Some planned to reach Sutter's Fort by mid-November. Instead, by the end of October, they were sealing windows with shirts and laying canvas over logs to trap whatever warmth the fire could offer. But the fire didn't offer much. Each time a cabin's roof buckled, The smoke trapped underneath collapsed into the room like fog. Soot coated every surface. One woman wrote that her daughter's face turned grey by morning, not from illness, but from the air they breathed to stay alive. No one wrote down what happened to the oil lamps. Some had brought them, packed carefully in crates lined with straw. A cracked chimney from one was found buried in the floorboards of a shelter near Alder Creek. No light came from it. In the dark, people counted wood, not in cords or bundles, but in hours. A single branch meant a pot could simmer for 10 minutes. A length of pine meant they might sleep warm enough to keep fingers intact. One man used a book as kindling, not for drama, just necessity. He burned the pages one at a time, starting from the end. He left the cover intact. Children were told stories not to entertain, but to distract them while water refused to boil. A copper pan was passed from cabin to cabin. No one knows who brought it. The handles had been wrapped in cloth, burned through, then rewrapped in hide. It was one of the only vessels that survived both the winter and the salvage. Some tried to burn the ox yokes. They were thick, cured, and soaked through from weeks of snow. When they did burn, they gave off smoke so sour that it chased people from the rooms. Still, they burned them. One cabin built a chimney using stones from the nearby ridge, packed with mud that froze before it cured. The flue cracked within 2 days. They continued using it anyway. The ceiling above blackened. A singed glove was found tucked beneath a plank near the hearth. Fingers worn thin, the palm split. Too small for a man's hand, possibly a girl's. No name. At night, the light from the fires, when they caught, didn't illuminate anything. It only made the darkness behind it feel deeper. Smoke stung every eye. It stuck to clothing, to bedding, to the inside of mouths. One child developed a cough that turned red. They called it the cold, but it wasn't. And still, they waited for the heat. One rescue party wrote in their journal that they were guided to a cabin not by footprints, but by the faint smell of burned hair. Inside, no fire had been lit for days. The hearth was empty. A tin cup rested on the stones, upside down, as if drying from use. But there was no moisture inside. The fire that didn't burn wasn't a single failure. It was hundreds. A match that snapped in half. A twig that hissed instead of catching. A breath blown too gently, or not gently enough. Fire should have saved them, but it only prolonged the cold. And when the cabins were finally abandoned, the ashes left behind were cold long before they cooled. Even when the trails disappeared under snow, even when no one was expected to come, they still wrote. Pages torn from ledgers, scraps of linen, charcoal rubbed from a burned pot. Ink, when there was any, was melted from the last remaining bottles, thinned with snow, darkened with ash. They used what they had, not for posterity, but for hope. Many of the letters were never mailed. How could they be? There was no postal service at 7,000 feet, with snow swallowing the pass. But they wrote them all the same, to parents back east, to sisters in St. Louis, to husbands who had gone ahead to California, to children too young to understand why everything suddenly tasted like boiled leather. Some were found folded inside hymnals, others were tucked into waistcoat pockets, stitched into hems, pressed between the pages of Bibles. One was wrapped around a comb and buried beneath the floorboards of a shelter. It was addressed to, "My dearest, should you ever come." The ink had run, but the lines were still legible. It didn't say goodbye. It just said, "I miss the shape of your hand." Who did she write it for? Was it meant for someone who had already died, or someone who never arrived at all? Another letter, unsigned, had only a list, not of supplies, not of names, just a string of words: button, spoon, locket, her ribbon, 2 cups, the gloves from Springfield. It read like a packing list, or perhaps a ledger of things someone refused to let go of, even after the firewood ran out. Could it have been Tamzine? She was known to be methodical. She journaled, wrote essays, taught her daughters to read during the journey west. When her belongings were later recovered, they included several blank notebooks and a letter folded inside a silk scarf. The letter had no greeting, only instructions. "If I do not return with the girls, tell them I chose to stay." And then, beneath it, a single sentence written smaller: "It was not because I was brave." We don't know if her daughters ever saw it. There's a mystery here, not in the survival, but in the preservation. Why did these words endure when the people who wrote them did not? Why did so many messages remain unfinished, unsent, unclaimed? Is it because, even in despair, people still reach for the ones they love? One scrap, found years later, had been sewn into the hem of a child's jacket. It said nothing more than, "Keep walking, keep walking, keep walking." It was likely meant for a child too small to understand why no one was speaking anymore. The paper was brittle. The thread was still tight. Some letters were never found. We only know of them through second-hand memory, through survivors who said someone had written something important, something final, something that mattered. But when asked to produce them, there was nothing to show. Did the snow take them? Were they burned for kindling? Or were they buried intentionally, meant to remain unread? Even Patrick Breen, whose diary survives in fragments, mentioned writing a note to his family. No such letter was recovered. Maybe he never finished it. Or maybe he gave it to someone who didn't make it down the mountain. In a salvage trunk, recovered in the spring of 1847, one letter was found wrapped around a silver button. The ink had faded entirely. Just the impression of the words remained. A letter without language. A message that refused to erase even when time tried. And isn't that what letters are? A way of staying behind when the body can't? A way of saying, "I was here," even if the trail loses your name. What else might still be buried beneath that snow? What other sentences are waiting in silence for someone to read them? It should have worked. By the time James Reed reached Sutter's Fort, he was worn thin from exile and frost, but he was still moving. His children were still up there, somewhere beyond the snow line. His wife, Margaret, had stayed behind in a leaking cabin with two of them, while the others had already been left at Truckee Lake. Reed knew what the mountain could do. He'd crossed it once. He would try again. He wasn't the only one. 2 more rescue parties had formed. Supplies were gathered, names were written down. A path was charted. This time, they said, they'd reach them. But the mountain doesn't care about lists. The second relief, delayed by weather and confusion, brought hope and just enough food for a few to walk. They took 17 people out, but they left more behind. They said they'd come back. Some they left at a place they would later call Starved Camp. There, the snow covered everything. The sun barely rose. A fire could not be lit high enough to warm the feet. Margaret Breen was left in charge. She tore her shawl into strips to bind the feet of the children. One boy gnawed a strip of buckskin off his own mitten. Another chewed a button from his coat and spat it out when it cracked between his teeth. Each morning they waited, but no one came. Across the pass, 2 of the rescuers returned to Bear Valley to retrieve food from a hidden cache. They didn't make it back in time. By the time they returned, the camp had quieted. 2 bodies had been consumed. A decision had been made. Even before that, there had been warnings. The first rescue group had seen the signs. Children clinging to mothers who could barely lift their heads. Men unable to speak. Rooms where a foul stench lingered under the smell of wet pine and melting snow. One rescuer described a woman rocking an empty blanket. She wasn't crying. She wasn't speaking. The blanket had nothing inside. She just rocked. Further up the mountain, at Alder Creek, rescuers found a cabin where only 1 adult remained. The children were wrapped in skins, too weak to speak. A pot in the corner was covered. When one of the rescuers lifted the lid, he put it back down without saying anything. He didn't mention it again for decades. That's the part history rarely records, what wasn't said. The 3rd rescue team came through weeks later. They found fewer people than expected. Some had died. Others had been abandoned. The storm had returned, and not everyone could move fast enough to keep up. Among those who couldn't was 5-year-old Isaac Donner. His body was found curled beside the roots of a tree, arms wrapped around his knees, as if waiting for someone to come. No one had. By the end, the 4th rescue party came not for people, but for things. They salvaged trunks, pistols, mirrors, coins, and crates. They buried what bodies they could. They took what items still had value. One of them found a small silver cup, engraved with the initials EG, half filled with melted snow. No record lists who EG was. They took the cup anyway. Tamzine Donner had stayed with her husband. She could have left. She didn't. By the time a rescuer returned, only George's body remained. Tamzine's was never found. One man claimed she had come to him, asking for help, and died that night. Another said he never saw her at all. someone else claimed to have found her gold. No one claimed her name. The story told later was that 4 rescue missions had saved the Donner Party. But when you read the journals, the timelines don't match. The bodies outnumber the departures. The rescues came too slowly, too late, too spread apart to save everyone. And so the question remains, what do we call it? When help arrives, but doesn't reach you? When the names are read aloud at memorials, and yours is only remembered by what you left behind? Is that still a rescue? Or is it just the story history writes, so it doesn't have to sit too long in the silence? Virginia Reed would later say that she didn't cry much during the snow, not because she wasn't scared, but because fear, like cold, had layers. You felt it first on the surface, then deeper in the bones, and then not at all. By the time they began eating boiled leather, she was numb to almost everything. The cold, the hunger, even the sound of people dying. She was 13 when it began, and nearly 14 when she walked out of the mountains. Others were younger. Mary Donner was 7 when she watched her mother fade over days, wrapped in a coat that never truly warmed her. She remembered the exact moment her younger brother stopped speaking, not because it was dramatic, but because she had asked him a question and he hadn't answered. That silence, she would later say, was the loudest sound she ever heard. Eliza Donner was only 3, and yet her memory held images long after they should have dissolved. The feeling of fur beneath her hands, the sharp smell of salt pork, the way her sister's hair froze in curls against the edge of the bedroll. She never forgot those details, even when the people around her insisted she couldn't possibly remember them. But she did, and she wrote them down decades later, not as stories, but as corrections. Because even by 1911, the public wanted one version: the cannibals, the blizzard, the madness. What they didn't want was the waiting, the boredom, the hunger that wasn't dramatic, the quiet that wasn't cinematic. Children remembered the other version, not the one made for newspapers, the one made of small things, the creak of the cabin wall, the dampness of wool socks left too close to the fire, the way snow sounded when it fell against canvas roofs, and the way adults spoke when they thought the children were asleep. One boy, years later, would claim that what haunted him wasn't the starvation, it was the smell of boiled bone, and how no one said what it was, even as they passed it around. He never said what happened to his mother, only that, for one night, her blanket was given to someone else. Another girl said she didn't remember the names of the rescuers who carried her out, only that one of them had hands like her father's, large, with the scar across the knuckle. When she tried to look at his face, she fell asleep. Many of the children were adopted after, folded into families that needed help or wanted to be seen as charitable. Some of them lived comfortably, others less so. The children of Jacob and George Donner were passed among strangers for years. Some changed their names, others never did. When they were old enough, they were asked for their memories. Not gently, not privately, often by journalists, and usually for spectacle. They were asked, "Did you see it?" They were asked, "Did you eat?" No one asked, "What did you carry?" or "What did you leave?" And so they learned to tell parts of the truth, enough to quiet the curiosity, enough to keep the silence theirs. But not all of it stayed hidden. A girl once opened a box from her mother's estate and found a pressed ribbon, stiff with age, folded beside a letter never sent. It was addressed to someone no longer alive. She burned it without reading the rest. Another survivor kept a fragment of wood from the cabin doorframe, smoothed down, stained, turned into a pendant she wore beneath her dress until the day she died. What did the children remember? More than we think, less than they wanted to, and never in the order we asked them to recall it. Their memories weren't for history, they were for survival. The chairs didn't match. In a room lit by oil lamps and winter light, some seats were carved mahogany, others bare pine. The table was scratched from prior use, not a courtroom, not a parlor, just a room. What they gathered to do there wasn't law, but close. It had the weight of decision, the weight of finality. The items were arranged without commentary. A brocade shawl, a silver-backed mirror, a trunk with initials scraped into the lid, and a pair of boots stiff with dried snowmelt. There were books, loose pages, torn ribbon, combs with teeth missing, a pistol wrapped in fabric, a child's cup with a name half scored into the metal. They did not belong to anyone in the room. That was the purpose of the auction, to sell the remainder. Each item had once been carried across mountains, chosen, protected, some folded into canvas, some worn next to skin, all now presented as detached inventory. A ledger sat on the table, open to the first page. The ink was new, but the silence around it was older than anything in the room. "Lot 7, the clerk called. "One trunk, contents as found." There were no questions. The buyer nodded, wrote a name beside the number, and moved on. Some things broke before they left the room. A perfume bottle shattered in a box when someone closed the lid too hard. The smell of lilac filled the air, sudden, out of place, like a ghost of someone who had once worn it. No one looked up. The silverware gleamed, but no one asked who had polished it last. One fork still held a spot of tarnish shaped like a fingerprint. A woman inspected it, then turned away. Emotion did not make bids. What mattered was value. And value now was weight, material, resale. Not history, not grief. But some couldn't help it. A girl in the back clutched a scarf she couldn't afford to bid on. It had belonged to her cousin, one of the first to die. She'd recognized the stitching, the way the ends had frayed unevenly. She left without making a sound. A man bought a journal he didn't read until weeks later. Inside, an unfinished entry. "If you find this, tell them," followed by blank space. No name signed, just the imprint of a pen pressed too hard, caught in hesitation. The rest of the page was clean. He didn't tell anyone he had it. When a child's trunk was opened, Someone made the mistake of asking aloud, "Was she rescued?" The room fell quiet. The clerk didn't answer. He simply cleared his throat and moved to the next line. Lot 12. What do you do with someone's history when they're no longer here to carry it? What does it mean to own the items that outlive the people who chose them? The auction wasn't for memory, it was for space, for the clearing of what could not return to the mountain, for making clean what had once been covered in snow, sweat, and silence. But not everything could be clean. A name carved into the underside of a pew was left as it was. A spoon inscribed with the word home went unclaimed. And one pair of gloves, child-sized, still stained at the fingertips, was returned to the box. No one bid. Before the mountains and the snow and the silence that followed, there was the road west, long, slow, sunlit, full of decision. The first choices weren't about survival. They were about comfort, identity, and presence. What do you bring when you are leaving one life behind to begin another? What does a family choose when they believe they'll arrive, alive, intact, and proud? They carried tea sets wrapped in quilted linen, family portraits painted in miniature and sealed behind glass, writing desks with compartments for ink and sealing wax. They packed brass candlesticks, copper kettles, lace curtain bonnets, and dining forks engraved with family initials. Each item placed into the wagon was a vote of confidence, not in the trail itself, but in what waited at the other end. Some brought books, not just Bibles, though there were many of those, but novels, poetry, school readers, grammar guides. One girl carried a folded sheet of music for a song she hoped to perform once they had a piano again. Her instrument didn't make it past the first mountain pass, but the sheet stayed folded in her coat pocket until spring. Among the reed's possessions was a hairbrush carved from boxwood, polished smooth at the handle, passed down through 3 generations. Margaret Reed kept it wrapped in muslin and buried deep within her trunk, not because she needed it often, but because it was one of the last things her mother had touched. A woman in the graves party packed a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, bound in ribbon, not addressed to her, but to someone she had loved once and lost. She didn't explain to the others why she kept them, but when the salvage party opened her trunk months later, they found the ribbon had been retied, more recently, more carefully. Luxury in this story doesn't always announce itself as wealth. Often it appears as sentiment, as the unnecessary thing no one wanted to leave behind. A set of porcelain cups painted with forget-me-nots. A bottle of perfume so sweet it overpowered the smell of livestock in the wagon bed. A velvet-lined box of sewing tools, their metal still bright when they were finally found, although the velvet had rotted away. Not everything was kept in trunks. Some wore their memories, lockets tucked beneath shirts, rings sewn into waistbands, beads threaded into hems. A child carried a silver thimble on a ribbon around her neck. A man in his 60s packed a folded Confederate flag, although no one ever saw him take it out. They brought medicine as well. Laudanum, camphor, castor oil, bottles carefully labeled and stored. Many of them were never opened. Others broke during the crossing, spilling into clothing that reeked of vinegar and sugar. The labels wore off, the meaning faded. Some of the most enduring objects were the smallest: a pocket watch, a penknife, a mirror no larger than a palm. These items tended to survive, not because they were stronger, but because they were kept closer, in pockets, inside boots, around necks, tucked into bodices and stitched into seams. What makes a thing worth carrying through salt, wind, thirst, hunger, and then snow? The answer changes as the days pass. At first it's about what might be useful. Later it's about what can be left behind. In the end, it's about what matters enough that it doesn't leave you, even if you leave it. Some survivors spoke of the items they lost. Others never mentioned them again. But a few years later could describe an object in perfect detail: the color of its trim, the smell of its wood, the sound it made when opened. These recollections often arrived before names, before locations, even before the memories of pain, as if the object carried the moment more clearly than the mind could. That, perhaps, is the final legacy of what they brought to California. Not what survived, but what outlasted memory. Maps showed it as a crossing, a passage between one promise and another, but for the families who tried to pass through it that winter, the Sierra Nevada did not behave like a trail. It behaved like a decision already made. The first snow came earlier than expected. That wasn't unusual. What made it fatal was that it didn't stop. One storm followed another, layering powder into weight, sealing the ridges, swallowing the passes, and transforming a route they had been told was navigable into a wall. No wheel could crest and no animal could press through. The trail did not end. It disappeared. They hadn't known the range could hold so much cold. Their wagons were not built for it. The wooden wheels cracked under pressure. The iron rims contracted in the night air, and canvas tops stiffened to the point of fracture. When they tried to continue, the path no longer resembled the one they had followed for 6 months. Landmarks vanished beneath drifts. Footprints filled within minutes. Trees lost their shape. One woman said the silence was the worst part, not the cold, not even the hunger, but the way the air stopped carrying sound. Voices became shallow, distance lost meaning. A call from 20 feet away could fade as quickly as steam from a cup of melted snow. Patrick Breen wrote in his diary that they were within 3 miles of the summit when they turned back. 3 miles. But by then the horses were dead, the oxen buried in snow, and half the company walking barefoot because their boots had been soaked and frozen solid. One man carried a girl on his back for nearly a mile until she asked him to put her down. She didn't say why. She never spoke again. They had been warned, but only in abstract terms. Words like early weather, difficult terrain, and unexpected delays were spoken in St. Louis, in Fort Bridger, in casual tones by people who had never seen what a blocked pass really looked like. They hadn't been told that the wind could erase the horizon, or that the drifts could swallow a cabin up to its eaves. Some members of the party tried to climb out anyway. They made snowshoes from oxbows and rawhide, laced with whatever they could find: bark, shoelaces, torn straps. They left with small bundles, jerky, a hatchet, a Bible, and the belief that the trail would reveal itself again if they just got high enough. But the trail didn't open. It curved into blindness. When one of the rescue teams returned in spring, they didn't follow the same route in reverse. They had to cut around it. The trail had shifted, narrowed, vanished. One guide said it was as if the mountain itself had swallowed the path to keep it from being followed again. Even now, modern hikers have traced portions of the Hastings Cutoff and the Sierra crossings. Some find pieces of wagon wheels, rusted nails, fragments of glass. Others find nothing but snowfields and silence. A few report strange stillness, as if the space refuses to give up the memory of what happened there. Most pass through without knowing how close their steps fall to graves unmarked and names unwritten. The map still exists. It's kept in a case, temperature controlled, the ink darkened with age, the line of the past still drawn as if it had never failed anyone. But maps lie in straight lines. They don't record snow. The trail didn't close with an official order. No marker was placed. No notice was posted. It simply vanished one night under the weight of a storm that didn't stop, and a silence that didn't need to explain itself. If you made it this far, tell me what you carried out with you. Was it the snow, the silence, the 3 miles too far? If this chapter spoke to you, let it be known. Leave a comment, like the story, and subscribe, because the next trail, like the last, doesn't always begin where the map says it will. Most survivors of the Donner Party didn't tell the full story, not to neighbors, not to children, and often not even to each other. When asked directly, they offered only parts: the snowfall, the trail, the rescue. They described the silence, the cold, the weight of time passing too slowly, but they left out details. Not to lie, but to live. There are letters, fragments of recollection, and interviews taken decades later, but they rarely match. Some claim they didn't remember much. Others said they remembered too clearly. Both versions were true. Mary Graves once told a neighbor that she still dreamed of the tree outside the cabin, not of what happened inside, not of the snow, not of her mother's body, but of the tree, leaning slightly to the right, with one broken branch that hung too low. That was what stayed. Virginia Reed, after arriving safely in California, wrote a letter to her cousin. Her father helped edit it. She left out the smell, the rot, the sounds made when there was nothing left to cook but bone. She left out the nights when no one spoke and the mornings when someone didn't wake. She promised, instead, that faith had carried her through. Perhaps it had, but others remembered different things. A man named William Foster confessed that he shot 2 of the Native American guides who had accompanied the snowshoe party. He claimed it was mercy. He claimed it was strategy. No one asked him again. Louis Keseberg, the man most closely associated with the darkest parts of the story, denied the rumors for years. He said he had only done what others had already begun. He said he had no choice. He said nothing when they accused him of theft. He said nothing when they accused him of eating what could not be named. What could he have said that would be believed? One of the Breen children was asked, years later, if she had eaten human flesh. Her answer came slowly. She said, "I don't remember." But the way she said it suggested that she did, or that she remembered something else entirely. There are gaps in every testimony, paragraphs missing, names skipped, locations blurred, not from age but from will. To survive what happened was one thing, to speak, it was another. Objects remained where memory failed. A bonnet folded in a trunk, a child's glove, kept long after the hand that wore it had stopped growing. A ribbon tucked into the binding of a hymnal, still red, still soft, still tied. But the people left behind their names in softer ways. A pause before answering a question, a refusal to attend church during certain seasons, a cupboard that held no meat, a door that was always left open, even in winter. What do we choose to forget? And when we do, what does forgetting protect? Some say trauma bends backward, that it reshapes the past as a way of saving the future. But in the case of the Donner survivors, forgetting wasn't a mistake. It was how they continued, a kind of silence that made breathing possible. Not every horror needs to be retold. Sometimes survival means remembering just enough to know you made it, and nothing more. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It leaked into the mountains slowly, softening snow that had held its shape for months. Icicles began to loosen from cabin roofs. Bark, long hidden, re-emerged beneath melting drifts. The sound of running water returned first, faint at the edge of hearing, like something forgotten that had never quite left. Then came the smell. Not fresh pine or thawed earth, not flowers. The air turned sour as the ground softened, beneath collapsed shelters and trampled paths, beneath overturned wagons and fallen branches. The forest began giving up what the cold had preserved. The first bodies were found not buried, but curled, under canvas, near the doorways, in makeshift beds, some with arms still crossed over the chest, others half turned, as if they had fallen while trying to rise. One girl was found beside a broken lantern. It had never been lit. Patrick Breen's cabin held the worst. Survivors had written letters by then. They had confessed, denied, speculated. But none of that prepared the rescue team for the weight of the silence they stepped into. The stove had collapsed. The walls had buckled. Inside, they found what had been left because it could not be taken. What exactly was found has been debated for generations. Some claim the floor was stained. Others said there were bones arranged deliberately, not scattered, not broken, just placed. A folded cloth was found beneath a bench. It held 2 rings, 1 small spoon, and something that may have been a page from a prayer book. The ink was gone. The words did not remain. At Alder Creek, the discovery was colder. The snow had preserved more there, flesh that had not rotted, faces still visible, blankets still draped. The Donners had not built proper cabins. They had dug shelters, low to the ground, sealed in with pine and hide. The snow had pressed them tighter as the winter continued, packing the roofs into weight that could not be lifted. George Donner's body was found first, arms drawn in, lips parted, eyes shut. Tamsin was not with him. The man who claimed to have seen her last never produced evidence, only words. He said she died in his shelter. He said she begged for help. He said she left the gold behind. Others found the gold. Her body was never recovered. Some bones were moved to higher ground. Others were left where they had fallen, too fragile to disturb. A boy's wrist, still wrapped in cloth. A foot bone inside a child's shoe. An adult rib cage found apart from its spine, as if something had separated it carefully, not violently. For decades, bones continued to surface. Wagon repairs unearthed them. Logging crews stepped on them. One archaeologist found fragments beneath what had once been a hearthstone. Burn marks, yes, but not conclusive. Most of the bones were animal, cow, deer, dog, but 1 or 2, not. No official cemetery was ever built. No line of markers, no stone ledger. The mountain kept more than it gave back. Some families placed headstones years later, far from the original camps, in soil untouched by snowfall. Others said prayers, but left no name behind. Today, the Donner Memorial stands tall, cast in bronze, feet set high to mark the snow line of that terrible winter. But the bones aren't beneath that stone. They remain farther out, scattered, nameless, quiet. Spring unearthed them once. Then time did the rest, and still, the mountain does not say who is where. It only returns pieces, one at a time, without apology. The survivors didn't all stay silent, but the stories they told rarely agreed. Some spoke early, others waited decades, and a few never spoke at all. Still, their names appeared in articles, memoirs, and interviews written by people who had never touched the snow. The first accounts were crafted not by survivors, but by journalists and speculators, eager to shape the narrative before anyone else could. Objects appeared in those reports: a silver crucifix in a frozen hand, a velvet shawl burned at the hem, a china teacup beside a child's body. These images stuck, but few were ever confirmed. They weren't always real, but they made the story real to readers. Virginia Reed's letter became the most widely read account, revised with her father's help, published with restraint. She mentioned hunger, hardship, and faith, but not what happened inside the cabins. Mary Graves, years later, recalled her mother's death. but the article focused on the gold-trimmed curtains in her home, as if grief needed embroidery to be believed. Then came the storytellers, novelists, pamphleteers, dramatists, who added what history had left blank. Dialogue, motives, even names. The spoon passed between survivors, the letter found in a coat pocket, the locket buried beneath snow. These were details crafted to feel true, even if they weren't. Louis Keseberg became the villain. He was accused of cannibalism, theft, murder. He denied it, then admitted it, then denied it again. The contradiction didn't weaken the story, it made it stronger. Complexity didn't sell, simplicity did. Some survivors moved on. They built homes, raised families, lived quiet lives. But they kept certain items in view. A ring no one wore, a spoon that was never used, a trunk that was never opened. These weren't mementos, they were warnings. Luxury returned in soft, deliberate ways. A mirror displayed, but never touched. Lace used for company, but not comfort. Silver that had outlived the names engraved in it. These things spoke, even when their owners did not. The monument at Donna Lake stands tall, snowline marked in granite, names etched in bronze. But it doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't mention the objects left behind, or the auction, or the missing graves. It doesn't ask who got to tell the story and who chose not to. There was no ceremony. When the snow finally softened and rescue teams returned to the mountain, they found bodies, not buried deep, but resting just beneath the thaw. The cold had preserved them, not hidden them. Limbs curled inward, clothing still damp, faces visible or already gone. Few graves had been dug. The ground was too hard. What burials happened were shallow and shared. 2, sometimes 3, laid in the same hollow. No crosses, no carved stone, no names. Most were remembered only by location. Near a cabin wall, beneath a pine, beside an ox yoke. One child was found under an ox hide, shoes still tied, hair pinned neatly. No name recorded. Rescuers wrapped what they could in blankets or oilcloth. Some were carried down. Most were left. A salvager wrote that he placed a stone over one body. No carving, just the gesture. The official monument at Donna Lake was built decades later. Names etched in bronze, placement guessed. But the dead remained scattered, beneath the trees near Alder Creek, under snow-packed trails now walked by hikers who never know what lies beneath. Luxury objects turned up beside them, a silver spoon near ribs, a linen-wrapped comb holding strands of hair, a child's brass ring found in a pocket with a torn ribbon. One body was found covered by a crushed velvet coat, its lining embroidered with faded blue initials. No survivor matched the name. The coat was never claimed. Families later placed stones wherever they could, far from where the remains truly lay. Some guessed at dates, others sent for granite. But for most of the lost, there was no stone, only trees, only time. They were fathers, daughters, sisters, forgotten and unnamed. Not everyone was remembered, but not everyone was lost. The first ledgers recorded weight, flour, rifles, yokes, cloth by the yard. They listed names, though not all were spelled correctly, and some appeared only once before vanishing entirely. The early pages showed order, a caravan moving west with purpose. But by the final entries, the ink ran thin, the handwriting frayed, and whole lines were left unfinished. Years passed before anyone opened those books again. Historians came first, looking for evidence, the kind that fit into categories: birth dates, arrival points, casualties. But the ledgers held something else: gaps that didn't align, names that couldn't be verified, and objects listed without owners. One trunk, found decades later in a private collection, still had a folded sheet inside, an inventory. China set, 6 pieces, scarf, green silk, comb, carved. No initials, no origin. The comb matched one found at the Alder Creek site, but no one could say with certainty it was hers. Another ledger surfaced in Sacramento, a small pocket journal, brittle with age, recording items sold after the tragedy. Spoon, silver. Mirror, cracked. Gloves, child's all bought anonymously. The buyers left no remarks. When the state began to formalize its memory of the Donner Party, they referenced what they could. But the records resisted simplicity. One map contradicted another. A date listed in a diary didn't align with military reports. Names changed spelling. Ages were guessed. Some were remembered for what they carried. Others, only for how they died. Among the surviving documents was a salvaged prayer book, still faintly marked in pencil. Inside was a line, not from scripture, but from someone's own hand. If ever this is read, let them know we tried. It wasn't signed. The name may have faded, or maybe it was never written. Luxury items returned in unexpected ways. A bonnet with Belgian lace passed down through a family that no longer remembered its original owner. A pocket watch engraved with a G and a year. The same year George Donner died, but not confirmed. A letter opener inlaid with mother of pearl, found in a drawer labeled unclaimed. Today, these pieces sit behind glass, not to impress, but to mark presence. Not value, but weight. Objects that survived where names did not. The ledger never really closed. It was paused. And every time another fragment is found, a button, a ribbon, a name in unfamiliar handwriting, it opens again, asking the same quiet question. What else did we forget to carry forward? They didn't die as people, they became symbols. Almost as soon as the last rescue party returned, the narrative shifted from memory to myth, from journal to newspaper, from grief to headline. Cannibals in the Sierra, frozen wretches, the party that ate itself. It didn't matter that most of the survivors never resorted to it. or that those who did spoke only when asked, and even then, only barely. The myth had already taken hold, and it offered something the truth never could: closure. Stories spread that were never recorded in the ledgers. That a woman roasted her husband's bones. That a man had eaten even before anyone had died. That a child had gone mad, speaking to the dead. None of these were confirmed, but they echoed. And as years passed, the myths didn't fade. They hardened. In 1879, historian Charles McGlashan published History of the Donner Party, cementing the image of noble pioneers undone by snow, starvation, and in the final, unspoken chapter, by the unbearable necessity of consuming one another. The book sold well. His interviews included direct survivor quotes, but also editorial flourishes. He softened the language, removed contradictions, rewrote timelines. The survivors were still alive. Some of them read their own stories in print and did not recognize themselves. Virginia Reed objected privately, but publicly said little. Mary Graves was never quoted again. Keseberg sued for defamation and won $1. Tourists came next. By the 1880s, travelers detoured to see what was left. They asked where the cabins had stood, where the bones had been. They bought postcards, a few chipped fragments from burned trees to take home as souvenirs. A hotel was built nearby, and by the time the bronze monument was erected in 1918, solemn, snowline marked, names carved in permanence, the myth had fully replaced the people. Luxury returned again, but in performance. A wax museum recreated the scenes in full dress. Velvet coats, lace collars, silver cutlery laid neatly beside imagined plates. The set design was exquisite. The history wasn't. Real artifacts, the gloves, the locket, the spoon, were boxed in climate control, rarely seen. But the stories made up after the fact, those were displayed without shame. And still, the myths persist. That they were all cannibals, that they were fools, that they brought it on themselves. The real story is more human, more uneven, less cinematic. It's not a single collapse, but a slow unraveling of leadership, of trust, of time, of truth itself. They didn't know it would be the last. When the final relief party left Bear Valley in early April 1847, the snow was still deep enough to bury a wagon upright. Their boots sank with every step. Provisions were packed with caution. Ropes were coiled. Blankets tucked tight against the cold. No one knew who might still be alive. Only that someone might. This time, the rescuers were few, mostly men who had made the journey before, carrying more memory than hope. They didn't talk much. They already knew what they were walking toward. At Truckee Lake, they found what they expected: silence, frost, rot. The cabins were still standing, but caved in under snow. One had collapsed entirely, its roof pressed flat into the floor. The others leaned. Inside, it was damp and airless, the stench soaked into the walls. They counted the bodies and tried not to count the rest. Some children were still alive, too weak to walk. A few had gone blind from malnutrition. Most didn't speak. One child clutched a button, polished smooth from handling. Another refused to let go of a spoon. A girl had wrapped herself in a faded green shawl that once belonged to someone else, someone no longer there. At Alder Creek, the Donners were gone. George had died weeks earlier. Tamzina was missing, her body never found. Rumors said she went to another camp and died in the night. Others claimed she gave her gold to a rescuer who returned alone. No one agreed on what happened, but her daughters survived. Louis Keseberg was the last adult found alive. He was discovered sitting alone, his legs too swollen to walk, surrounded by objects no longer his, jewelry, clothing, coins. He was questioned, accused. He said little. What he did say shifted with time. Of the 87 who entered the mountains, only 48 came out. And even now, those numbers blur. Some died on the trail before the snow, others after rescue. A few names disappear from records entirely. The final party left with what remained, the quiet ones, the too small, the barely breathing. They carried them wrapped in canvas, wrapped in cloth, wrapped in memory. One rescuer later wrote that he could not remember the names, only the sounds, the wind, the dragging of boots through melt, the crack of frozen branches beneath the weight of silence. There was no victory, no line crossed, no moment of return. There was only descent, and a quiet knowing that those left behind would never be named, nor properly buried, nor understood. But they had not been forgotten, not entirely. They returned carrying less than they left with. Most came home with nothing at all. No trunks, no horses, no gold. Just the weight of what they remembered, and a few things they hadn't been able to let go of. Virginia Reed kept a hair ribbon her mother had given her before the pass. It had stiffened from sweat and ash. She never wore it again. Mary Graves brought back her mother's ring, twisted out of shape. She wore it on a chain, never on her hand. Some survivors carried objects others had left behind: spoons, lockets, buttons, combs. Not as keepsakes, but because they couldn't bring themselves to drop them in the snow. These things didn't speak, but they stayed close. Many returned to find the world uninterested in their survival. Some were pitied, others shunned. Keseberg was cursed in newspapers. Reed's family was offered charity, then blamed for their decisions. Few asked what had been lost beyond life. Still, traces endured. A mirror placed quietly on a mantel, a spoon displayed but never used, a child's thimble tucked into a drawer no one opened. They brought home no glory, no wealth, only objects that refused to explain themselves, and memories that never fully closed. There was no moment when the story ended. No one closed a door, laid down a final word, or declared it over. The survivors scattered, some to farms, some to cities, some to places where no one knew what name they had carried through the snow. They rarely spoke of it, not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. Some carried guilt, others just wanted to live in a world where no one asked what they'd eaten to stay alive. Silence became a kind of survival. Even their children didn't always know. Stories were passed down in fragments, a blanket that never left the bed, a rule never to waste food, a look that ended conversations before they began. For some, memory returned only in dreams. Voices calling through wind, footsteps in snow, the sound of pots boiling when nothing was inside. They woke sweating, then said nothing. Public silence turned into cultural forgetting. The headlines faded. The books softened the details. The monument said only what it had to. But beneath that silence, the memory stayed, not as a tale to be told, but as something lived through and carried quietly for the rest of a life. Time erases, but not completely. Cabins collapsed, graves went unmarked, names faded from memory. But some things remained, not because they were built to last, but because they were never fully let go. A comb, a spoon, a torn letter, a child's glove kept in a drawer long after the hand that wore it was gone. These weren't artifacts, they were proof. The monument at Donna Lake still stands. Tourists visit. They read the names. Some ask questions. Most don't. The trail is quiet now. Pines grow where smoke once rose. But if you stop long enough, you can still feel it. Not the horror, not even the hunger, but the weight of everything that was carried and everything that never made it home. No one tells a complete story. This one is no exception. Some things were lost, others were hidden. A few were buried too deep to name, but even silence leaves a trace. And the mountain isn't the only one that kept secrets. In our next video, we descend into the gold-rich canyons of the Rockies, where a hidden trail promised fortune. A small team of men vanished, and the only things recovered were rifles and rumors. Next up, the forgotten Rocky Mountain gold hunt that turned deadly. If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just history. It's memory, waiting to be uncovered. Leave a comment if something stayed with you. Like the video and subscribe, because the next trail is darker, colder, and still unclaimed.